60 minutes, maybe a little less, and then we'll open the forum to questions. For those who are live streaming, please use the chat feature, and that'll work for you, and those will be displayed up here. And for our audience, please use these mics that are positioned at the bottom of the aisles, and our ground rules are, please tell us who you are, and please ask a question. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Simons, and Craig, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm glad to be moderating this panel. Like you, I know most of these guys. I also want to thank you and the Institute for all that you do to promote and sustain interest and understanding in the history of the United States Navy, problems today, and the way the Navy has handled circumstances in the past, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit today, and that is leadership and decision-making in the Pacific Theater. Let me introduce the panel, who are all actual friends of mine. I'll start at the other end, alphabetically, with Tom Cutler. Hardly needs an introduction to this audience, I suspect. Most of you know him or know of him through his many books and articles and proceedings in naval history magazines. I first met Tom 35 years ago. I looked it up, Tom. He was teaching over in the Seamanship and Navigation Department at the Naval Academy and came over to teach naval history to plebes because he loved naval history so much. And his love for that subject was so palpable, he was tremendously successful in the classroom. The mids loved him. Tom then became my associate chair when I was chairman of the department, and we have been friends ever since. He's currently the Gordon England Chair of Professional Literature at the Institute, and I understand recently endowed with a new title as the Institute's Naval Historian. Among his many other projects, he's currently working on a biography of Ernest Evans, the hero of, or I should say one of the heroes of, the Battle off Samar during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Again, proceeding alphabetically, to my right, Trent Hone, another well-known authority on the history of the U.S. Navy, especially the 20th century U.S. Navy, 21st century U.S. Navy as well. His byline has appeared in dozens of Institute publications, as well as several books, including his newest, which I'm going to hold up here, Mastering the Art of Command, which focuses particularly on Chester Nimitz, who will be a subject of our conversation today. Trent brings particular insight to that consideration because in addition to being an authority on all things naval, he's also an expert in the field of broader leadership principles and organizational structures. Paul Stillwell, in the middle of our group down here, is another old friend. We used to play softball together some 30 years ago. I think our softball days are behind us now, Paul, yes. I'm afraid. In addition to Paul's tenure when he was editor of Naval History magazine, I'm convinced the entire community of naval historians, and certainly including me, will be indebted to him for his leadership of the oral history program, which has saved from obscurity the memories of many Navy veterans. Also a prolific author in his own right, and has written a number of valuable books, the most recent of which, just out, is another show and tell, Battleship Commander, which is a life and study of Vice Admiral Willis Lee. More about him soon enough. So the Institute has given us a big topic today. The Pacific was by far the largest command theater in the Second World War. A piece of information that I have to say out loud because I always find it almost destabilizing, is that if you take all of the landmass of the planet, all of the continents and all of the islands and all land on planet Earth, it would fit inside the Pacific Ocean with 5 million square miles to spare. So we're talking about a big area here. And one of the problems with that, of course, is managing so large a theater, not only in terms of command decision-making, but also, and maybe particularly, in terms of logistics. So I want to start at the top of that command pyramid, if I may, with Chester Nimitz, which means, Trent, I'm going to give you the first question here. But I want to emphasize that I'm hoping this will be a discussion not just a question and answer routine. So if anybody wants to jump in anywhere along the line and add their views, please do. Trent, I hope you'll tell us a little bit about how Nimitz got this job to begin with. We know now with the benefit of hindsight that it was a brilliant decision, but not everyone thought so at the time. How did it come about?
Nimitz had actually been offered the office before, which I think is quite interesting. And, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, before the United States enters World War II, he's offered, the commander-in-chief role, and he turns it down. And I think that was an astute decision on his part, because for him to achieve that position, he would have leapfrogged a great number of other officers that were advanced of him in terms of their career and their standing. And he didn't want to create a dynamic that would make it more difficult for him to work with them. He's very sensitive to this ability to collaborate effectively with other naval officers. And so he wanted to be able to obtain the role, succeed in the role, but succeed not as an individual, but as a core member, a leader of an effective team. And a lot of the work that he does after he assumes that responsibility is building that team, forming that team, making it cohesive and acting together. But I do think there is an interesting anecdote in the aftermath, in the very near-term aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Navy Secretary Frank Knox goes to Pearl Harbor, examines the devastation for himself, is convinced that Admiral Husband Kimmel, the current Commander-in-Chief of the fleet, will need to be replaced. And so he and President Roosevelt start discussing, well, who's the best suited, for this opportunity? And Nimitz had been the next one up, sort of the second on the list prior to Kimmel achieving it. And FDR's like, yeah, I'm happy with that next
FDR
one.
knew Nimitz because Nimitz had been chief of the Bureau of Navigation, which is now the Bureau of Personnel. So he knew him. He was a known quantity. Of course, Roosevelt took great pride in knowing all admirals.
Yes.
That was a thing with him. So this was a known quantity for FDR.
Well, absolutely. And I think that is a key part of the choice as well. So FDR not only knows him, right? He's been there in Washington, head of the Bureau of Navigation, Bureau of Personnel. But FDR also has a sense for Nimitz's ability to understand the capabilities of naval officers, particularly more senior naval officers. It's a community that isn't very large. And Roosevelt has confidence that Nimitz is going to be able to figure out how to get the most out of these officers, how to organize them effectively.
Not everybody had that kind of confidence. King wasn't so sure he's the guy.
No, King has a different perspective. I think if we look at Roosevelt, he has a sense of the importance of interpersonal relationships. Like everyone who comes close to Roosevelt has some comment about his ability to either act politically, if they want to be a little, introduce a little dig, or diplomatically, if they want to be more complimentary. King is much more, how do we get this job done? And this job is warfare. And King is not certain Nimitz is best suited to do that. He thinks, well, Nimitz may be more of a paper pusher, an administrator, someone who can, smooth over these relationships.
He called him a fixer.
Yes.
Yes. Whatever that means.
Which was not a compliment.
No,
in the context of the time. King is not sold.
So Nimitz finds himself in this position with a commander-in-chief who apparently has his back, but a boss who maybe not so sure. How did he survive this? He tells his wife in this letter, I'm not sure I'm going to survive 6 months. But he does. And what's the secret to that success? He
does. There's a few key things that I think he does that allow King to begin to gain confidence. So I'll list a few of them. One of them is he acts aggressively very early on, finds a way to reinvigorate the morale of the fleet by beginning to attack Japanese positions. So there's the raid that Admiral Halsey leads into the Marshall Islands. Admiral Fletcher is part of that as well, the 1st of February. And this displays that not only can the Pacific Fleet fight back, but also within a couple of weeks begins to reveal intelligence that this is having an influence on Japanese decision-making. This intelligence arises through code-breaking, cryptography, signals intelligence, and the like. King is still pressuring Nimitz.
Yeah.
And so Nimitz takes the officer who had been the interim fleet commander between his tenure and Kimmel's, Vice Admiral William S. Pye. Pye and King have had a long-standing relationship.
Yeah,
and
they're old buds.
Nimitz sends Pye to Washington, explain the situation as we
Good
can see
choice,
it.
by the way, to send Pye. That's
It's an
clever.
excellent choice. Yes, it's an excellent choice because Pye has been part of these command conversations. He knows what's going on within the Pacific Fleet's headquarters, and he's a friend of King's.
So let me ask you this question. We have this impression, I have this impression of Nimitz as somebody who gets along, who gets well, he's calm, he's benign and all this, but he's also clever. I mean, and sending Pye is an example of that cleverness. His ability to stand up to King without pissing King off, which is frankly pretty easy to do, suggests that there are depths here that beyond that calm, placid exterior.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I think there are valuable clues in Nimitz's 1923 Naval War College thesis as a tactical thesis. And the thing that it recurs through it is this idea of to command successfully, you have to be aggressive. You have to, this concept of calculated risk, which we associate so often with Midway, the precursors of that are in that thesis.
Yeah.
And so you can see that in the decision to attack in the Marshall Islands with Halsey. You can see that later on in the plans for Midway and Coral Sea. Yeah. And so there's this edge that Nimitz has that is underneath the sort of placid exterior. Yeah.
Although his aide, Hal Lamar, and the doctor, whose last name I can't pronounce, Gentro or whatever, notice that at some point his hand begins to tremble. So maybe, despite the calmness that we see, there's some tension in there. And the way he wants to solve that problem, or at least address that question, is they erect a pistol range, a shooting range outside his office, because that forces the shooter, and Paul, you know where I'm going with this, right? That forces the shooter to concentrate, to steady his nerves in order to take advantage of that. And so I'm shifting now to Willis Lee, because Willis Lee, for those who don't know, was a crack shot, won a pocket full of medals at the Olympics. 7? I mean, however many? What?
8, yeah.
8 Olympic medals for both pistol and rifle. Does that give us a window into Willis Lee? Was he so calm that he could win 8 gold medals, and did that allow him to be successful in command?
Exactly so. And before getting to Admiral Lee, I'd like to add a footnote because authors do use footnotes. In those softball games 30-some years ago, Tom was involved also. And we're retired now. In 2011, I had a hip replacement, and the medical people said, whatever you do, don't run unless it's absolutely necessary to save your life. And I said, thank you very much. I haven't run since. I want to add one thing on the code breaking. Joe Rochford gets a great deal of credit for running Station Hypo in the basement at Pearl Harbor, led to the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and so forth. He was a Japanese language student, and he had a rare gift of being able to fill in the blanks that the code breakers themselves could not. And the code breaker who was really getting the parts that could be gotten was Tommy Dyer. And I interviewed him not long before he died, and he had a Colonel Sanders look-alike, and he had a perpetual twinkle in his eye. And I asked him, what was the sensation for being able to look through and read those Japanese messages that they didn't want us to read? And he said, well, the physical sensation was not the same, but it was as satisfying as sex. So imagine that. I asked him, where would you rank yourself, with no false modesty, among the code breakers, the pure code breakers? He said, I was the best. Well, there's no false modesty there. A person who did have a great deal of modesty was Willis Lee, graduated from the Naval Academy in 1908. He had grown up in Kentucky, and I talked to people back in Kentucky who knew him when he was young, and they said, he seemed to have an unlimited amount of enthusiasm for shooting at things and unlimited amount of ammunition. So weather vanes, wildlife, somebody's upstairs window. He came to the academy in 1904. In 1907, the National Rifle and Pistol Championships were held at Camp Perry on the shore of Lake Erie. And the morning of the event, by a single point, he won the rifle championship. The afternoon, as he confessed later to a classmate, Thomas Kincaid, I decided that might as well do something else, so then he won the pistol championship, the only person to do that. Ironically, he did this even though his vision was so defective that he could not see well at all without glasses, didn't recognize his roommate from across the street.
Yeah.
He cheated with the help of his classmates. He would always fail the eye test. And then he would ask his classmates, well, what chart are they using today? Because he had memorized all the charts and he'd just read off the letters. So there was a bit of guile in him, and he took that to the Olympics, 1920 in Antwerp. 5 golds, or 6 golds, a bronze, silver and a bronze. And there's a picture in my book. It shows in the Secretary of Navy's office, Josephus Daniels, and there beaming in the middle is Daniels, and on one side is Carl Osborne with his 1 medal, and Willis Lee with his 8. He translated that into what he did in shipboard gunnery, in destroyers, in cruisers, and coming up to World War II, he was very concerned about big gunfire with the battleships, the cruisers, anti-aircraft, because Japanese posed a formidable air arm as it demonstrated at Pearl Harbor. So he worked on radar, fire control, both the big guns and the 5-inch, 40 millimeter, 20 millimeter. And he had that cool sang-froid going into the Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. And Trent and I have talked about this. There was a tremendous battle on the 13th of November around Guadalcanal. Admiral Halsey was trying to stop the Tokyo Express from coming down and reinforcing the island with soldiers, supplies, food, ammunition. So it was imperative to stop this force, which included the battleship Kirishima. Lee had the Washington as his flagship, the South Dakota, 4 destroyers. The destroyers unwittingly became the sacrificial lambs. They led a column in narrow waters where battleships were never intended to fight. Destroyers got taken out by gunfire, by torpedoes, and burst into flames. Only one of the 4 survived. But Lee's flagship, as they approached the destroyers, steamed to port, putting the burning destroyers between them and the Japanese. South Dakota had a power failure, lost the bubble for a little while, went to starboard, and she was silhouetted by the burning ships, and her superstructure was riddled. She just took a lot of damage. Lee's force pummeled the Japanese, sank the destroyer Ayanami, and sank the Kirishima. That was the second battleship the Japanese had lost at the beginning of the war in 2 days. And Samuel Eliot Morison proclaimed that the victory that night, 14th and 15th of November, was the turning point in the road when the offense was starting to go toward Tokyo instead of being on the defensive. It was Lee's coolness, his ability to use radar as a weapon, and the
Well, let me follow up on that just a bit, because it struck me in reading about this in your fine book, that someone who was so skilled at using hand weapons, pistols, rifles, had a gift that would lead them to think, making judgments by the seat of the pants is where I am. And yet he is among the first to embrace and use effectively radar-controlled gunfire at a time when, quite frankly, others were a little suspicious of it. This newfangled thing, I'm not sure this will work. This is not the way I was trained at gunnery school and so on. But he embraces that. Now, why?
He was not only embraced it, but he was an ardent proponent for it, because he had a mathematical mind. His roommate at the Naval Academy said the only things that seemed to interest him were shooting and drawing sketches. He could pass the test without studying. He could do trig problems in his head that helped in ship handling. But he saw the value more than his contemporaries of being able to combine the gunnery ballistics and the fire control. And in his action report, he said, the Japanese are well trained. The big difference really was that we had radar and they didn't. And he also was a strong proponent of the proximity fuse for anti-aircraft guns, the 5 inches. It used to be that you had to lead the target as you would in a duck blind, shooting to where you expected the duck to be. Well, this would automatically compute that lead angle, and you didn't have to actually hit the Japanese aircraft. There was a little radio transmitter that would hit the Japanese plane, send back a signal, that would explode the shell. And his being a proponent of that led to much wider adoption of those projectiles.
I have to inject a little bit, because you use radar. I forget exactly what you said, but
Radar-controlled gunfire.
Yeah, it's not controlled. It's not so controlled. I mean, the one Lee does this well because he understands the mathematics, the principles behind it. He understands how radar works, and so control is not exactly what Washington does. If you read the details of the action report, her gunnery group, it's radar ranges. So the radar is very accurate for ranges, but they're using visual bearings, so they get a bead on the Japanese battleship. They know where it is. They know how to line the guns up. And if you contrast that with South Dakota's behavior, I mean, certainly South Dakota steams a way which unfortunately exposes her to the Japanese gunfire when many control systems are down because of the power outage. But her crew focuses more on radar ranges and bearings, shoot less accurately as a result.
But you see, this is a classic example of why this generation that finds itself at the beginning of the war, only the major combatants had any kind of radar at all, and radar becomes more and more sophisticated as time goes on, and the people who are in command positions by the middle of the war, by, in this case, November of 1942, and certainly by 1943, are beginning to figure it out, but it takes them a while to get this stuff.
It does. Yeah. And you've got to have these detailed knowledge, right? It can't just be radar.
So Lee was the right guy in the right place for that battle. And of course, the other time, one of many other times, that Lee is prominent in this war is during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here's my next segue. That allows me to hold this book, which is edited by Tom Cutler. One of 2 books Tom has done on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And I want to talk about the Battle of Leyte Gulf a little bit. Tom, as I mentioned, is writing a book about Ernest Evans, who was on the receiving end of the Japanese attack in the Battle off Samar, and the product of Halsey's decision to abandon San Bernardino Strait. I'm sure we're going to hear more about this, but I want to hear Tom's take on this question. If Evans and his peers in those other small ships did literally save the day, is that because of him, or does he represent a generation of naval officers who were simply doing what they knew was expected of them at the time? Was he a hero, or was he a naval officer?
Excellent question. Well, the thing about, let me just make one quick footnote, if I may. You're right, I've written 2 books about, or done 2 books about Leyte Gulf. The first was for the 50th anniversary of the battle, and then the second was for the 75th anniversary. But I decided not to wait for the 100th anniversary, and that's why I'm working on this 3rd book about it. At any rate, but yeah, Ernest Evans is an interesting person. You know, listening to all these names being dropped here, all these different names that we've heard just in a few minutes in the Pacific War. And you begin to form certain conclusions, and one of them, and also the fact we're talking about leadership here. Well, we are always getting leadership manuscripts here at the Naval Institute Press. I've got the secret sauce to leadership. And I mean, they just are constantly coming. And people are always looking for that secret recipe. What is leadership? What makes good leadership? And of course, there are principles you can draw from that and universal thoughts and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is, look at these people we're talking about here and their leadership styles. Between King and Nimitz, already pointed out,
Very different.
and Lee and so forth. I think that really says a lot about what leadership is. It's a very individual, personal kind of thing, and how people play their own talents to use that. Some better than others, obviously. So I think that's one thing you can draw from that. But Ernest Evans is kind of an enigma in many ways. We don't know as much. I wish we knew more about him, because writing a biography about him is a challenge for that reason. There's a lot of empty space there. But one thing we can conclude is this guy was definitely aggressive. He, from his earliest days, he showed signs of aggression. Back when aviation was not viewed as the gun club, when he was coming out of the Naval Academy, aviation was kind of like, well, why would you want to do that? Well, the one thing it was dangerous, and it was daring and that sort of thing, and that appealed to him. So he applied for flight school. He flunked out.
Eyesight? It often is. That's the only reason.
Yeah, I think it was. So anyway, yeah, he didn't make it through flight school. Pretty early on, he dropped. He was sent back to the surface fleet.
Now, see, if he cheated like Willis Lee on the eye exam, he could have been an aviator.
History would have been different. That's right. That's right. But I think we could say it might be fortunate that he didn't, because he served the surface Navy well. What you have to understand about him is he saw his first combat back in the Battle of Java Sea, which is very early in World War II. And this agglomeration of British, Australian, Dutch, and American ships are all put together. What they have are consolidated into this, they call it the ABDA force, using the first initials. And they are trying to stop the Japanese from taking over the Dutch East Indies, and by this time it comes down to Java. And the Japanese are coming towards Java, and the battle that ensues winds up to be a defeat. There's a lot of courage exhibited there, but not a whole lot of skill. They've got a lot of problems, communication problems. They don't speak the same languages. They don't speak the same languages, and they don't have common doctrine, all these sorts of things. So it turns out to be a significant defeat. But the one thing that comes out of that is that Ernest Evans is there on a destroyer as the executive officer of USS Alden, which is an old Clemson-class destroyer that's was obsolete almost when she was built, and by this time, World War II, she's really obsolete. But there are 4 of these ships, and they do make a charge at the Japanese, which gives time for the other ships of ABDA, which are now pretty well beat up, to turn away and escape, to say fight another day, but they ultimately get sunk. But that's afternote. But at any rate, but for the moment, they play an important role by running a torpedo run. And so this is kind of a precursor to what Evans is going to be doing later on, much later in the war. But the one thing that really bothered him about that, and not him alone, there were others who felt the same way, that many of them felt they were conflicted about it. They were relieved that they escaped. They were the only 4, by the way. All the rest of the ships, the Dutch, the Australians, the British, all were sunk. But the 4 American destroyers managed to escape. Relieved at that, of course, but at the same time, not feeling, well, we ran in that kind of thing. Understandably, but at the same time.
Am I wrong in thinking that they used up all their torpedoes?
Yes, yes.
And were told, well, you're out of ammo.
Absolutely. They were absolutely
So,
out of torpedoes, and their guns were only 4.1-inch guns that were ridiculously under caliber for the challenge and so forth. So they had to, they were told to leave, and they did, and they got away. But they were troubled by this. But Evans in particular, and so that at the commissioning of, he later finally gets to get back in the war. For the next couple of years, he's trailing around. He gets command of Alden and takes her to the Caribbean and to a couple shipyard periods and so forth. And he's sitting there. He's kind of like if you've seen the movie or read the book, Mr. Roberts, this terrible frustration of not being in the war, being at the front. And Evans, this aggressive personality, is stuck in that limbo, this purgatory. And so finally he gets command of a Fletcher-class destroyer. And these are the best destroyers ever made, and many people will argue that. He gets command of one of these, but at the commissioning of it, he stands there at the commissioning ceremony and he says, "I ran from the Japanese once, I will never do it again." And then he tells his crew, if any of you are not with that, basically there's the door, go, but we're going after the Japanese, makes it pretty clear. So, and of course he follows through on that, and that's the big story of Leyte Gulf, or the charge
Well,
of
part of
Samoa.
that story is Ziggy Sprague, too, because Sprague tells him, here come 4 battleships, take your little destroyers and destroyer escorts and go.
Yeah.
And nobody says boo, they all do it immediately, but
Right. Yeah, you're right. I mean,
it
I
takes
didn't
courage
answer
for
your
Sprague to give that order as well.
Yeah, I didn't answer your question in that, yeah, they're all naval officers. And Evans with the Johnson is not the only one who charges at the Japanese. They all do. The destroyers, destroyer escorts, they're all going on this incredible suicide charge. We don't want to tell too much about it because we wanted to buy the next book. But anyway, but seriously, it's an incredible story. Most of you probably are quite aware of that. But I do think there's a certain element of course, we're going to do that. The thing that's interesting to me about naval warfare that's different from land warfare, and there are a lot of differences, but one of them is the fact that the captain is the one who, it's his courage that represents the rest of the crew. You can be the starboard butter cutter on the ship, but you're going to attack the Japanese along with the captain, whether you like it or not. And that's kind of an interesting dynamic, I think, and in writing this book, I'm trying to get across things like that, to try to put things at the tactical level and also looking at how the crew would view things. I served in a destroyer that was not a Fletcher, but she was the next class after that, very similar in some ways. So I have I didn't serve in combat in that ship, but I served in that ship. So I have some understanding of what it was like to be an enlisted man on a ship like that. And I'm trying to bring some of that vision into what's going on there and so forth. So anyway, so that's one thing I'm trying to.
Well, the reason that Evans and Sprague, for that matter, is on the receiving end of this charge by Japanese heavies is because they came through San Bernardino Strait. And there was nothing at San Bernardino Strait to stop them. Now, Paul, in your book, you talk about this. Lee, of course, is the commander of this nascent surface force, Task Force 34. It was organized, but the execute order hadn't gone out yet, so there was confusion about where it was, and everybody knows the famous query that came from Pearl Harbor, where is Task Force 34. But the question I wanted to ask you was that you make it very clear that Lee, particularly the testimony of his flight lieutenant, Gil Ertzen, how do you pronounce his last name? Gil Ertzen, that Lee was pissed off that Halsey was doing, that Halsey was going after the bait carriers. He was leaving San Bernardino Street unguarded, and Lee was not on board with that, and he sent first a flash message and then a voice message. And I guess my question to you is, did he try hard enough to convince Halsey?
He tried as much as he thought he could, and Mitcher had essentially the same reaction.
I was going to ask you about Mitcher next.
The boss has more knowledge of this. He was not an assertive person, and he figured there was only so much he could do. He twice alerted the flagship to the Independence planes sighting reports that Kurita and his force were heading east towards San Bernardino Strait. And all they got back from the flagship New Jersey was Roger. Evan Thomas wrote a book about the Battle of Leyte Gulf and had a fascinating, illuminating story that Halsey was already in bed and asleep by the time those messages came. So Halsey was not in on the information on which he might have made a decision to leave Task Force 34 behind. And so that could be the failure of the staff. They knew that Halsey wanted to go after Ozawa's carriers, but they weren't going to wake the old man. And he was nettled when he got...
This is a component of leadership, too, not just the decision maker at the top, but the group you establish around you. We
Exactly.
haven't talked about Douglas MacArthur, which we can do, but I mean, he famously had a staff of yes men and sycophants around him. If Halsey's asleep, what's the responsibility of that staff? Wake him up, get him up, give him this information. Doesn't happen.
Well, he became irritated when he got where is Task Force 34, the World Wonders. And a retired naval aviator told me a story. There's no corroboration that Halsey had not learned about the sighting reports. And when he got the message, that's the reason he was so angry, not because he was being nettled by Nimitz.
Do you buy it?
Who knows?
Good.
Well, I was going to say that so I have, to disclose, I have a piece in here.
Yes, each of you has a piece in this book.
Yes,
I know
Paul
that.
does as well, and mine is about Halsey's
Right.
decision making, like what happens, and I think it's the staff. I think a lot of the problem is with the staff, but that doesn't mean it's not Halsey's fault. He's responsible for the organization of his staff and how it operates and what information it brings to him and whether or not it wakes him up because new information emerges. And one of the things that I found interesting, I don't think I had seen it by the time I wrote this, but certainly by the time I had written the Nimitz book,
yeah.
is Nimitz and King, and they have conferences throughout the war. And they come together and talk about various things. A lot of it is about personnel. King is leveraging Nimitz's familiarity with the Navy's officer corps. One of the things to talk about is Halsey's staff.
Yeah.
And it's inadequate. And they know it's inadequate. And they were talking about, well, what do we do about it? They hadn't done enough, arguably, about it at the time of Leyte Gulf, because this happens. And to some extent, what Halsey decides to do is a mess or a challenge of Nimitz's own making, because he is dissatisfied with the results of Philippine Sea. Other members of his staff are as well, and they are exerting an influence. But he had hoped that the victory at Philippine Sea would be more dramatic in terms of Japanese ships sunk, to free the ability of the Pacific Fleet and its amphibious forces to operate and accelerate the offensive against Japan. And so,
By the way, just let me jump in. For those who may be listening out there in the virtual world who are unaware, 3 months prior to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Halsey famously left San Bernardino Strait unguarded, allowing the Japanese battleships to come through, a battle in the Philippine Sea conducted by Spruance. And of course, Halsey and Spruance took turns in command of the Big Blue Fleet. Spruance had made the opposite decision. He ordered Mitchell to stay within 200 miles of the beachhead to make sure that's covered, that's job one, before he could go off to chase after the Japanese carriers. And Halsey believed that was a mistake, and many aviators did as well. So that's the background to this decision.
yes, Halsey thinks that's a mistake, but also he gets orders that essentially say, if I can paraphrase it right, if an opportunity arises to win a decisive action over the Japanese fleet, take it, seize it. So those are instructions that Spruance didn't get.
Yes.
Nimitz has altered his instructions, and that just builds off of the aggressive disposition that Halsey has, because like Evans, he's an old destroyer hand and likes to go charging into battle, and he does.
Yeah. There's a story that Chester Nimitz Jr. tells in a post-war oral history, where he's having dinner with his father, and they're discussing this circumstance, what we're holding, and the son asks Admiral Nimitz, what order did you give him? And the father confesses, acknowledges, that he said, if an opportunity arises to destroy a major portion of the Japanese fleet, that will become your primary mission. And the son looked at his father and said, well, then it's your fault. And the response, according to the oral history, is his father said, well, that's your opinion. But I don't know what tone of voice he said that.
Right.
So, and we don't know, but yeah, we'll revisit this.
Well,
Tom, you want to jump in on this? You're the-
just a quick thing. You mentioned that that phrase comes in about if the opportunity arises, so forth. I compared operation orders from Philippine Sea to the Leyte Gulf, and that phrase is inserted where there was standard phraseology for most of the operations that are coming up, you see this one phrase suddenly inserted because of what happened at Philippine Sea, which is kind of interesting. If you look at it, it doesn't even quite fit. Somebody has not
It's
quite
an
fit it.
insert. You can tell it's an insert.
Exactly.
An insert.
Well, one of the speculations about this, if Task Force 34 had been left to guard San Bernardino Strait, or if it had turned around even 3 or 4 hours sooner, it might have led to a confrontation between Kurita's heavy battleships and heavy cruisers and Task Force 34. Well, here's the speculation. Paul, who wins that?
Well, of course, the U.S. ships, battleships. Lee was sent out in September of 1942 to command the fast battleships, in fact, all battleships in the Pacific Fleet for a while, and stayed there till the spring of 45, and his mission was to be ready to fight the Japanese heavy ships should the opportunity arise. Well, the opportunity was forced upon him at Guadalcanal. In June, at the Marianas, Arleigh Burke, who was Mitcher's chief of staff and a very aggressive surface officer, got Mitcher to send a message and say, Lee, take your battleships and go get the Japanese. And Lee sent back a message, do not wish to engage the Japanese. My ships have been in the carrier screens. They've not had an opportunity to operate together, so we're not ready. Some have suggested that as a cowardice on Lee's part, but Lee was not a coward. But they had not trained, and his flag lieutenant, Ertzen, said he talked about this later with Lee, and Lee said the tactical situations were completely different. And the Marianas, the Japanese were steaming away from us, didn't constitute a threat. In the Philippines, they were coming toward us. We could have capped their tea at San Bernardino Strait. And his radar officer said that they could shoot over the horizon and hit the Japanese ships before the Japanese could bring their optical rangefinders into play.
Yeah.
Well, there's an important caveat to that message of Lee's at Philippine Sea. It's about a night engagement. He doesn't want a night engagement, which is, it creates greater variability and uncertainty regardless of capabilities.
And
But
he's
San Bernardino Strait would
still,
have been a daytime engagement.
Daytime.
right.
I suspect you are correct in all of that. And yes, the 2 Japanese super battleships had 18.1-inch guns, but you got to be able to hit something with them.
And one of them's gone. One of them's already sunk.
And one of them's already there. She's already sunk. Yeah, that's true. All right. It is now 3:45, and I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. There are a couple of folks we haven't discussed yet. I'm going to throw this out to the panel about who else we probably ought to mention here, but I want you to begin thinking about what questions you might have both here and out in the virtual world, and I guess the questions will appear on the screen here while we discuss this last question. And my last question to all 3 of you is, well, we've talked about the subjects of your books, Nimitz, Lee, and the people who worked around them, for them, and over them, but who have we not mentioned in this? And I will confess that Paul sent me an email a couple of days ago saying, why haven't you put Charlie Lockwood in this? Charlie Lockwood deserves a conversation. How come, Paul?
The submarines contributed a great deal to the winning of the war in the Pacific. There was a previous commander of the submarines in the Pacific, Robert English, who died in a plane crash, and that brought Lockwood, then a rear admiral, forward from Australia to Hawaii. The submarines performed poorly during the first part of the war, in part because of a lack of aggressiveness on pre-war skippers who were coming in, and partly because the torpedoes were faulty. Lockwood weeded out the good skippers, he weeded out the bad one, kept the good skippers, and he did pragmatic tests to see what was happening with the torpedoes and demonstrated that the exploders were not working. Even if they'd hit the ship, no explosion, just a dud. And so that's a poor payoff for a skipper who takes his submarine in within a couple thousand yards and launches And then the Japanese know he's there because they felt the thud. So he got that fixed. And there were so many great skippers, very aggressive. These were the underwater counterparts of Ernest Evans. One in particular whom I came to know and admire was Slade Cutler. 4 Navy Crosses and 2 Silver Stars, 19 and a half Japanese ships credited for. And from a strategic sense, this was a great contribution, depriving the Japanese of the raw materials coming up from Southeast Asia. And tactically, they made contributions as well, including scouting and sinking of Korea's flagship, the Otago, at Leyte Gulf.
I agree. I think Lockwood is somebody that tends to get overlooked, but I'll make one. Trent knows this, and that is that if you go to the cemetery in San Bruno, near San Francisco, where Nimitz is buried, there are 6 graves in that separate plot. They are 3 officers and their wives, and they are Nimitz and Spruance and Charlie Lockwood, who all agreed they wanted to spend eternity together. So they got along well. Who else have we not talked about? Anybody? Tom?
Well, we briefly mentioned Spruance.
Yeah.
We mentioned him, mistake he made and that he's dead. I'd like to say something about him positive.
There's more to the story.
There's more to the story.
All right.
No, I think that Spruance deserves a great deal of credit. He's a personal hero of mine, and it's always, I'm not alone in the fact that Halsey gets 5 stars and Spruance doesn't, and that thing will go on forever and so forth. But I think that, you know, this was a man who was, again, a very different kind of leader from the ones we've been talking about, and exhibited the kind of skills that we needed at the right times and so forth. I personally think that he was absolutely justified in the way he handled Philippine Sea, despite the criticism that went around in the wardrooms and the ready rooms in the fleet, because his mission was to guard that thing. And remember that the Japanese, all through the war, have these elaborate plans where you're looking this way and they're coming in that way. They're trying to do all these different things. And there's always that fear that if he'd gone charging after the Japanese, that some other force might come in and disrupt that landing. So I think it's perfectly justifiable. But these debates go on forever, and they always will, and that's kind of what's good. Which brings me one more quite interesting point, I think. Sitting here in this discussion, we got 2 people on this panel here who have both written books about the same person. But I think this is good, because they're working from the same basic material, obviously, and yet their books are very, very different. And I think that says a lot about the historical process that we have, and the fact that if it didn't work that way, there'd be a lot fewer history books than there are now, which some people would argue would be a good thing, but I'm not sure. But there's always that opportunity to take that same material and look at it differently and come up with these things, which these 2 gentlemen have done. So I think that's an important element, and one of the reasons why we're sitting here doing this, I think.
Tom Buell wrote the classic biography of Spruance called The Quiet Warrior. And he said he talked to Spruance's flag lieutenant after Spruance took over the task force from Halsey, who had skin problems. And Miles Browning was the chief of staff, and overrated, erratic, and what have you. But Spruance is the one who launched the attack at the right time to catch the Japanese carriers, and that was a real turning point, moving from the offensive, or moving into the offensive phase, which was followed up at Guadalcanal, more of the offensive.
And he had to overrule Browning to do
Yes.
that. And Browning was the senior aviator on board, so that took something. So I see nobody lining up at the microphones here. I'm looking back in the room back there to see if we have any online questions that have come in. Here come some folks. Good, thank you. Nothing's appearing on my screen here, so I'm going to say that you probably get the first question. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Brian Perry, and I have 2 questions. One, with regards to Halsey and his leadership, when you look at his staff, you've mentioned Miles Browning, his chief of staff. Current scholarship seems to be that Mitchell essentially cost the U.S. a carrier by going off on his own at Midway, and you know, there's arguments been made that he would never have done that if Halsey had been present, you know, and then the incidents you've talked about at Leyte Gulf. And the question, does Halsey even know that was a decoy? does his staff have reason to believe he's a decoy and not a threat, or is it just an opportunity to sink ships? So what does that tell us about Halsey's leadership, the state of his staff? And my second question is, should Frank Jack Fletcher be in the discussion? Certainly post-World War II, his reputation suffered very badly, but I think current scholarship points to the fact that he was actually a very skilled commander. So I'm curious to think what you gentlemen think about Frank Jack
Those
Fletcher.
are both excellent questions. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll initiate with a discussion of Mitcher's decision and that a flight to nowhere. Is that what you have called it, I think? The seeds for that are planted in the op wards that come out of Nimitz's headquarters, right? There is an assumption that perhaps the Japanese will operate their carriers in two groups. And given what happens with Mitcher, right? I mean, he doesn't get cashiered or anything. He has a continued opportunity. He's placed in command of a carrier task force not soon thereafter, and then goes on to command the air forces in the Solomons. So it seems to me that there is some willingness to accept this idea that it's okay to try to knock out all the Japanese carriers in one blow if they are in two groups, which is what he's gunning for, right? Which makes me wonder, would Halsey have prevented that from happening? Or was Halsey in on this idea? Probably not.
Well, a couple of things here. I have to pick up this one. I'm sorry. I'm the guy who probably more than anyone else is responsible for the flight to nowhere explanation that Mitcher was deliberately seeking out what he believed to be a second group of two carriers. The intelligence reports early on had only reported 2 Japanese carriers. They were all 4 cooperating together. We know that now. They did not know that at the time. Mitcher was an aggressive officer, as Ernest Evans was an aggressive officer, as Willis Lee was an aggressive officer. He felt it was his duty to find those other 2 carriers and go get them. He's the senior aviator at Point Luck that day. He's aviator number 33. Neither Fletcher nor Spruance wore gold wings. Mitcher did. He felt, this is my responsibility. Off he went. They weren't there. Oops, never mind. The difficult part of this is that in order to disguise that and not to undercut this miraculous, near miraculous victory that the Americans have won at Midway, he submits a false report. Nimitz knows he submitted a false report because Spruance tells him. Spruance was there. Now, neither Spruance nor Nimitz decided to report this as a falsified report. And the reason I suspect, and I want to hear what Trent thinks about this, is because he didn't want to wash the Navy's dirty linen in public. We won this thing. We don't need to go around cutting off heads or cutting the legs out from somebody. He remembered when he was a midshipman in that big fight about the Samson-Schley controversy from the Spanish-American War, and gave the Navy a black eye. That's not going to happen on my watch. So he kept quiet. Now, Mitcher, of course, does subsequently become not only task force commander, but the senior commander of all Navy carriers in the Pacific, but he is shelved for almost a full year. He had already been announced as the commander of the Hornet Task Group. That was taken away from him, and he was sent to command the PBY squadron at Kaneohe. That's not exactly a step up. So I suspect that Nimitz knew this, that he was saying to Mitcher, we know you did this. I'm watching you. I'm not throwing you under the bus. Maybe you'll have a chance to come back, which of course he did. So that's the way I would respond to that particular circumstance.
I agree. I think that's an excellent interpretation of most likely what happened, given what we know about Nimitz. He tries to find roles for people to fit in that align to their capabilities.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
positions.
He's a people
right?
manager.
So and Mitcher is being aggressive. He is erred by being too aggressive in a way. Okay, we can work with that.
Yeah.
I think that's what Nimitz thinks to himself, or maybe even says to him, quite frankly. So you've got to sort of cool your jets here for a little bit. I want to keep an eye on you. And then, sends into the Solomons.
Right.
Serves very well.
Now, the other half of that question was Frank Jack Fletcher. Who's going
Right.
to jump in on Frank Jack? Tom?
No.
No.
I want to jump in on
Oh, you
that.
want to talk about
Well, no, the part of the question was about Halsey going off to the north. And I think, in fairness, I don't think that Halsey's error was going after the decoys. He didn't know they were decoys. That at this point in the war, we did not fully appreciate how decimated the Japanese were, and that the fact that there were carriers to the north was a valid target for him to go after. The fault is that he took everything with him when he had this gigantic, bigger than anything in history, fleet.
Even a
and
Pickett destroyer.
Right. I mean,
would've-
exactly. He took the entire thing with him, and that is
Well,
the
Mahan
fault.
said fleet concentration, that's the secret to success.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, and Halsey went to the War College and he read Mahan and so forth. And I read his paper that he wrote there, and I still don't know what it was about. But
Well, here's the other thing about Halsey and the decoy. He would not admit until the day he died, even on the day he died, that it was a decoy. He would never accept that, because if it was a decoy, he was duped.
Yep.
And he wouldn't accept that he
Right.
was duped.
Yeah.
So he never acknowledged that it was a decoy. Do we want to say anything about Frank Jack Fletcher before we move on?
Well,
I think John Lundstrom's right about this, by the way, on Fletcher. So, Paul?
Well, Lee, according to his aide, perceived that it was a decoy, and that's why he kept sending these messages to
Yeah.
Halsey's flagship. And John Lundstrom has done marvelous work about Fletcher. He got a bad rap because it seemed like he was always fueling when he should have been more aggressive. But
Is that King's fault or Fletcher's fault? I mean, King is the guy who never trusts Fletcher. He thinks he cut it off too soon in the Coral Sea. He thinks he was, as you say, always off fueling. He shouldn't have been fueling at Guadalcanal and had only 2 carriers instead of 3 when the Japanese struck. Not that it would have made any difference. But is that because King just had a thing about Frank Jack, or was Frank Jack cautious?
some of both. But King certainly had a thing for him because he sent him to the North Pacific and got him out of the combat
Yes, he did.
for the most part.
Yes, he did. By the way, he's always called Frank Jack because his uncle was Frank Friday Fletcher, after whom the Fletcher-class destroyers were named. And so they always used both names because otherwise people would get confused. Yes, sir.
If you're accepting questions from an old soldier, my name's Martin Irons. I'm a former medical service officer. So a question about Halsey, and actually going right back to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So he's 62 years old. He's
Not that that's old, by the way. I'm just
well,
that's clearly understood. Okay.
but it's a measurement. He's 62 years old. He's recovering from a virus. Some said the flu. He's had very little sleep in the course of the last 3 days. He's living on nicotine and caffeine. And at that point, he has had extracted 14 of his 32 teeth. He's had an acceleration of dental loss during the war. So the medical mind says on the calendar he's 62, but physically, metabolically, he's much older. So had they woken him up, had that message from Admiral Lee or Mitchell actually had gotten past Kearney and they'd woken Halsey up, would he have been physically in a position
Yeah, that's
to have
great.
made
No,
a
that's
different
good. We
answer?
get the idea of the question. Anybody want to take this on?
I'd say it's anybody's guess. We'll never know. But Halsey, on a couple of other occasions, walked into things that he shouldn't have. Those were the typhoons in December and the following spring.
Yep.
He should have been better advised to pay attention to his weatherman.
But this goes back to the broader staff, too. The circumstances you raised earlier, which were quite interesting about his being asleep. Supposedly, because of these physical ailments, because of his teeth pain and other things, the doctor was administering what often gets administered late at night to people who are having difficulty sleeping, a draught of Jack Daniels.
Medicinal alcohol.
And that they were reluctant to wake him up precisely because he had some physical ailments that they perceived as diminishing his capability for command. They were taking care of him. It's a staff officer's job to take care of your boss. And they perceived taking care of, let the man sleep. We now are looking at him and saying, well, how dare he sleep through this crisis moment? But
Well, there's preparation of the staff that goes on too to take care of the boss, but not just take care of the boss physically, take care of these decisions. Like, so we mentioned MacArthur, and I think you said he was surrounded by sycophants, right? But Sutherland, his chief of staff, knows well enough that when the proposal, initially sort of from Halsey up through Nimitz and then from Nimitz to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, hey, let's bypass all these intermediate objectives and advance to Leyte in October rather than December of 1944. Sutherland knows well enough, well, I can't communicate with MacArthur because he's at sea observing radio silence, but I better say yes to this because if I don't,
Yeah,
the
'cause he
boss is
knows-
going to be
yeah,
upset.
No, that's true. Tom, you have
And
a hand.
I just wanted
Oh,
to
I'm
say,
sorry.
Halsey has it teed up in a sense, not by his staff, but Gerald Bogan, who is commanding, if I remember right, Task Group 38.3, has a plan. My task group, Task Force 34, we'll hang out here. The rest of the Third Fleet goes north.
Right.
And we can fight them in both spots.
Right.
It's there. So all the staff has to do is say, yeah, we'll do that. You know, just sort of check the box. They don't have to formulate a new set of plans and orders. It's been teed up.
And he was rejected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things we got to keep in mind here, these are human beings, and they have human characteristics and so forth. And, you know, as historians, one of the things that really struck me when I was writing my first book, I'm sitting there judging these people, these admirals and so forth. I'm sitting there with drinking coffee and you know, my computer's erasing my errors and all this sort of stuff, and I'm telling them what they should have done or something like that. And that's a tough situation when you think about it.
Yeah, being a historian is great.
But yeah. Excellent. But you know, I mean, look at Kurita, for example, at Leyte Gulf. I mean, this guy, by the time he gets to this big battle, you know, the big question is, why did he turn away and so forth? Well, this guy he'd gone for a midnight swim. His ship is sunk out from under him 2 days before. He's going through San Bernardino Strait in the dark of night. He's done all these things, and he's got to be absolutely exhausted and so forth. The question is, does that excuse it? Well, we can't. I mean, he's still the man in command, and we have to go with what we got. So whether he's missing 14 teeth or didn't get enough sleep or whatever,
Or he's
it still
62
comes
years
in.
old.
Or anyway.
Okay.
So,
There you
so
go.
the part two, and real quick, is so Court of Inquiry past Leyte, Court of Inquiry past the Typhoon. Halsey's in the China Sea on January 10th when the word finally is released about the loss of the 3 destroyers and 800 sailors. Had that come out at the time, and he had lost King's favor, who would King and Nimitz have replaced Halsey with?
Wow.
Well, first of all, the
Awkward.
courts did not find him innocent. They found him guilty, and the verdict was overturned by higher command. King and Nimitz decided that it would impact morale at home if this hero and of course Halsey became a hero early on because of those raids that Trent mentioned in January and February of 1942 when we were really in the dumps. And here's some good news. Halsey did that for America, and so now to say, no, you're being relieved for cause, you're out. They wanted to dismiss him from the Navy, and that was overturned. So the high command was not going to let that happen, is the short answer and the cop-out answer to your question. But who, if not Halsey, who? I guess Spruance stays on the job.
And I think it's worth noting, too, that the higher command was concerned about the influence on the Japanese perception as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
It would give them
Right.
a PR victory.
Right, absolutely it would. True. Yes,
Yes.
I can barely see you through the lights.
Sorry about that. Lieutenant J.G. Dave Brandt, 1963. My question is, Roosevelt relieved the Admiral and General at Pearl Harbor, but he never relieved MacArthur, who, in my opinion, was much more negligent in the Philippines 3 days later. Why?
Well, my take is that for political reasons, he wanted to imply that all the dereliction of duty and so forth was in Hawaii, even though there were so many people in Washington who also failed to foresee what was going to happen. And MacArthur had a popularity, and that probably would not have gone down well with the public, nor would it have fit in with his strategy that all the problem was in Hawaii.
Brings us back to that personality factor. I mean, MacArthur is something unique, and he has this tremendous effect on people. They either hate him or they love him, and there are very few in between. But many, many people think that MacArthur should be running the entire the entire war. And you got to understand that people are naming their children after him. Indian tribes are making him chief. I mean, this guy, he's bigger than life. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. And that's what Roosevelt's up against, and he has to figure out what to do. If he makes him in charge of the entire war, he's going to lose half of his constituency. If he dismisses him or buries him somewhere, he's going to lose the other half. So he finds a compromise, and that's really why we have two completely different fronts working simultaneously in the Pacific, which says a lot about America. We're even capable of doing that. But the fact that this comes about this way, which mostly turns out to be a good thing, keeps the Japanese off balance because they're constantly responding to the two different things, runs into some trouble at Leyte Gulf when they finally come together and they don't have a common chain. Anyway, that's a quick summary. But
We all remember not too many years ago when there was an economic crisis in this country, and the phrase that was being thrown about is why some were suffering and others not, and the phrase was too big to fail. Remember that? The banks were too big to fail, the car
right.
dealership, and so
That's
on.
right.
And MacArthur was too big
Yeah,
to fail.
definitely.
It would have been such a blow. He was such a national hero, more so than Halsey, when Halsey encountered the typhoons and had to be saved because of his public reputation. I think you're absolutely right.
I was just gonna.
Question over here.
Oh, all right.
Hi, my name is Heather Haley. I'm a historian with the Naval History and Heritage Command, and I will admit before I ask my question that I'm a polywog getting into World War II history, so I'm, anyway. So you spoke earlier, and I squirmed a little bit when you were speaking about radar, because that is my interest in 1942, is the introduction of SG radar, the early battles of Guadalcanal. And I was hoping, I've spoke to Trent at length about this, so I'm actually gonna hopefully open it up to both Paul and Tom, and perhaps to some degree Craig, to get your opinions on, I think you had mentioned earlier, Craig, that there were some who were reticent to use radar. So the question that I posed Trent a couple weeks ago is this an older generation, just you young whippersnappers with your radar?
I'm sitting right here.
So yeah, I just would really appreciate your input on, at least in 1942, the introduction of radar. Generally, what was the consensus?
Well, Trent, you're the guy.
Yes, but
Well,
she's
but
already talked to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think you're absolutely onto something there, and the example I would use, and I invite people to discuss this, particularly Paul, I suppose, is that Dan Callahan, I think, in the early stages of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, in the middle of the night, in a rainstorm, the Helena had SG radar and was reporting to him the range and bearing, and he just either wasn't sure he wanted to trust that, or he didn't want to show his hand too early. I'm not sure what was going on there. But one of the things about radar during World War II is that it was like a Rube Goldberg trick in 1940. And by 1945, it was really sophisticated, gave you range, bearing, even altitude, things that were not possible in 1930 and 1940. When the California had a radar set put on, somebody said, well, it's like a bed spring sitting on the mast, and it's unreliable, and it's only good out to 60 miles, and it doesn't give altitude. But because radar improved so dramatically during the war, there were sort of stages of how much do I trust this thing? Am I on to this?
Yeah, I think you are onto something, although I would criticize your assessment of Callahan, because
Yeah, good, I want to hear that.
when he receives bearings from Helena, he changed his course to intercept the Japanese formation, to put his plan into action. So he acts on the information. We could argue he doesn't act on it quickly enough.
Well, he didn't fire any torpedoes. I mean, that's the thing. What you do is you fire the torpedoes when you know where the enemy is before you open with your gunfire. The gunfire initiated that conflict.
Yeah, but that was, at least from what we can reconstruct,
Yeah.
I would suggest
Okay.
that was
Anyway,
his plan. But anyway, yeah.
Poor Callahan dies in this. I don't want to pick on a man who died heroically and would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor, so I'll take it back.
I just want to say, I've known Heather since before she earned her PhD, and congratulations on that. I want to bring in the concept of the Combat Information Center, and Lee was a real pioneer in that.
Yeah.
They took what had been the flag sea cabin and turned it into what was in effect a primitive CIC. They had a radar repeater in there. There was not a radar repeater on the bridge, so Lee had to rely on phone talkers to get the information that was coming in radar. And ironically, this man who was blind without glasses, when the first salvo went out from the Washington, the blast knocked his glasses to the deck, and he was literally blind at that point. And he and his aide were reaching around so he could get him and see what happened. And I want to have one more discussion about Halseys and typhoons. My favorite work of fiction is The Cane Mutiny by Herman Wouk, and that typhoon is the centerpiece of that drama. And Captain Queeg just breaking up on the bridge. He lost control. And Lieutenant Merrick, the XO, is trying to maintain some sanity in the midst of chaos. And the helmsman is a man with a name very similar to mine named Stillwell. And Queeg says, "Get that idiot off the wheel." And Merrick very calmly says, "But Stillwell's our best man."
Oh, you told that whole story. With that, and speaking of ending, this is going to be our last question.
Well,
So
thank
please,
you.
go ahead.
Robbie Harris, a former naval person. First, I want to congratulate the Naval Institute and this outstanding panel. It's just really well done. I guess I'm trying to understand the leadership skills or warfighting skills that these leaders possess that you talked about this afternoon. It's my understanding that during the interwar years that there was an annual fleet battle problem, and that the Navy did not deploy the way it does today, and possibly wearing itself out the way it is today. But yet, when the war happened, there was a leadership skill there. There were the warfighting skills there. How did that happen with the fact that they had only one fleet battle problem a year?
Well, a good question, Robbie. I think the key is to think about it. I mean, the way that you phrased it, fleet battle problem, that makes it sound much smaller than I think these actually were. These are large operational exercises. I forget exactly which one it is, but there's one in the Pacific in the 30s that essentially spans from Hawaii north to the Aleutians. All right, so you're covering a vast area here, and so it's not just a battle. It's not a tactical engagement. It's how do we? Most of these are geared toward how do we approach these operational problems that we will encounter in a war in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan. And they're exploring that, and they're exploring that over a series of days, sometimes even into weeks. And some of these are tied together. So you might have spin-off tactical exercises that feed into or emerge out of the fleet problem itself. I think it's more appropriate to think about it as an annual training regimen and learning mechanism, right? New recruits come into the Navy, they become acclimated, familiarized with their ships, and then those ships begin to practice together in formations and squadrons, and then all on up through the year to culminate in this large exercise that examines an operational problem. And one of the key aspects of it also is that it's tied into thinking within OPNAV, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, which is thinking about what shape a war will take. What should the war plan be? And what are the challenges in this war plan? And then also the Naval War College, which is tangentially involved, but looking more at the future. What is a future naval battle 5 years out going to look like? What will airplanes be like? What kind of ships can we expect with the current construction that is underway to have in the fleet? And that informs then this exercise so that sometimes they will have constructive units, virtual ships, essentially, that allow the Navy to explore what it might be like to fight, not today, but 5 or more years from now. And all of this loops together. So not only are they learning about what it would be like to fight the fleet of the future, but they're also exercising officers across the fleet in terms of how to behave. They're conditioning them in a way. This aggressiveness you asked about Evans, you see that kind of aggressiveness in destroyer officers throughout the Pacific conflict. Evans is perhaps an exemplary example, but he's not unique
in that sense.
I'm not going to disagree with any of that. I think you're absolutely right, but I want to add one more thought, and that is that remember that at Midway in June of 1942, Nimitz had a hard time scraping together what we'll call 2.5 carriers to fight the Battle of Midway. By 1945, the United States has on its roster 100 aircraft carriers. Who manned those aircraft carriers? They weren't Academy graduates. They weren't people who'd been through training exercises, however elaborate they may have been. They were the soda jerks and truck drivers and college students and farmers who came to the flag when the need was there, who manned that fleet, like those on the King, and allowed the United States not only to survive that war, but to triumph in that war. And I've heard people say, we couldn't do that today. I don't believe them. I think we could. Admiral Daly, back to you.
Well, thank you. First, I'd like to thank Craig Simons, Trent Hone, Paul Stillwell, and Tom Cutler for a superb discussion. I think we could continue this, questions or no questions, we could continue this discussion for another hour, but I want to thank them, and let's give them a big hand. And yes, my father was Lieutenant J.G. Joseph T. Daly, Jr., USNR, who fought in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And you're right, 90% USNR. I'm pleased to present each of our guests, commanding the Pacific, Marine Corps generals in World War II. Perhaps that's a future session. By Stephen Taith, a Naval Institute Press book. And I want to thank our guests again. This is just a token of our appreciation. And before we conclude, I'd like to tell the audience that our authors will be available out in the foyer, in the atrium area with their books and available to do signings and discussions. So hope you take advantage of that. And again, let's give them one more big hand.
Okay.
Thank
After you?
Age before.
Let you get down there. All right, get to your.
All right.
It was good.